Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Jenkins. I'm the account manager for Connecting Up in TechSoup New Zealand, and I would like to welcome you to the webinar, Why Good Governance is Vital to Achieving Your Goals, which will be presented by Matthew Rowan from Process PA. We'll start with just a little bit of housekeeping here. All of the lines are muted, so if you've got any questions, please just type it in the questions box on your webinar panel, and Matthew will be answering them throughout the webinar. We will be pausing a couple of times. We'll also do questions at the end if anyone's still got any. Please note that your comments and questions won't be appearing to the entire group. It'll just be through to me. If you have got any technical issues, again, just type it in the questions box as well, and I will do my best to help you sort it out. Although I will note a couple of common issues here. If you're on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video on the webinar. So if possible, just try and close down your other programs to help you have the best experience you can today. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you all within a week after the webinar ends. You'll then be able to access it at any time. That's it from me. So Matthew, over to you now.
Excellent. Thanks heaps, Eric. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. So as Eric mentioned, I'm Matthew Rowan and I'm from Process PA. And so what we do at Process PA is we make governance enjoyable for associations, non-profits, and SME boards and management committees. I'm often asked by people, it's like, well, governance enjoyable. They're not usually put in the same sentence. But I hope by what we go through in this presentation, we'll see how governance is vital to achieving your goals and is a core piece there. And so with what we do, we try and do this through a software as a service, trying to take care of your administration and record keeping. And allow you to focus on the mission of your organization, which is vital for all of us, for the great work that the nonprofits do here in the country and around the world. So as you may have read in my, my bio for the webinar, I'm actually a software engineer. And so that's a bit odd to have a software engineer talking about governance, but I came into this field when I experienced the burden processes around board governance, and I thought there must be an easier way. So I dived right in, and we now try and help automate those processes around good governance. And so we've been learning a huge amount and have lots of experience with many customers now, and we're happy to share those with you today. But there are things that I want from you, though. You're on listen-only mode, but I don't want you just listening. There are two things I want from you. Firstly, is to be empowered. It's to know that wherever you are, in whatever stage you are in your governance journey and processes, that you can improve and get value. And so secondly, is just pick one thing, just one thing you see in the talk that you could implement. So I'm in the startup world and in product design, and where I'm in, we've got a process called build, measure, learn. And so I might mention this a few times through it, but it's really about don't spend the time planning to be perfect. And there's lots of information here which we'll be putting out there, but it's just try something small, see how it goes, learn from it and measure it, and then adjust and try it again. And so with that iterative approach, we can improve our process over time drastically. And so remember, perfect is the enemy of good. So we do want to just find those one things that we can take, test out, see if they work for us, and then iterate and improve. But first, a disclaimer. So as I said, I'm a software engineer. I'm not a lawyer. So anything provided here is general information only and not constituting professional advice from the presenter. So I'm sure you're all aware of that. And so it should be information that can help a lot, but yeah, just be aware. All right. So when we start a discussion about governance, we first need to be clear on what governance is. And when we mention governance, many different images and definitions come up. So I'm going to go through a few so that we can get to the bottom of what it really is. And as I love, we want to get to the practicality of what that is. And so we'll see if we can tease that out of the definitions. So firstly, if we go to the dictionary, Oxford, it defines governance as the action or manner of governing a state or organization, etc. Now it's like, okay, that's not particularly helpful. When we're talking about governance and we say govern, well, we haven't really got to the root of what govern is. So we'll get to that. But action, that's a good word. We want action, which often isn't associated when people think of governance. They don't think of much action, but it really is. And so then the verb there, govern, is conduct policy, actions and affairs of a state, organization, or people with authority. Okay, so here we have actions mentioned again, which is great. And then policies, and we all hear about policies all the time. What are our policies on everything we need to cover? And then the affairs of our organization. But also included there is the authority, and that is a really important thing, because if you don't have the power or the right to give directions, make decisions, and delegate, well, then that's going to be an issue. So the authority is very important. So that's really good. There is a lot in that definition, but I really want to get to something very practical. I've titled the talk, Why Good Governance is Vital to Achieving Your Goals. What in that definition really points to helping organizations make their impact? Setting policies and making decisions? Well, yes, maybe, but let's go on. So if we look in Wikipedia, which is the source of all information, governance is the process of governing. So here we have governance saying govern again, which is kind of circular referencing almost, but here we add the keyword process. And this process is good. And as we skip down a bit further in Wikipedia, we get to this definition, which came out of investigating policy processes in the governance analytical framework from the Research for Sustainable Development. And it says the process of interaction. Now, I really like that term, and I'll use that a lot. So our processes of interaction and decision making. So there's the other process. So unlike the definition we had within the dictionary, which is talking about action, which is great, here in Wikipedia, and these other writings, that we're talking about these processes of how to get that done. And so I really like that we're talking now about what are our key processes of interaction and decision making. And so this becomes more practical because we are building organizations which are out to solve a problem, as it says there. So the processes of interaction and decision making among the actors involved in a collective problem that lead to the creation, reinforcement, or reproduction of social norms and institutions. Those definitions are quite broad, and as you can see, it's talking about governing like states and governments are really high, but we're dealing with our nonprofits and our associations and organizations. Corporate governance is really the refined term that we want. And so the Australian Standard backs up these processes further within their definition, where they say corporate governance generally refers to the processes by which organizations are directed, controlled, and held to account. I love those three words there as well. It encompasses authority, accountability, stewardship, leadership, direction, and control exercised in the organization. So this is great. Directed, where are we going? Controlled, well, what measures do we have in place and levers can we pull? And then accountability, so who is responsible and what is the consequences, good or bad? And so then this leads us to what can be seen as good governance. So if we jump out to good governance then, according to the World Bank, so here we'll see the definitions are in the broader governance term rather than just corporate governance again. But I think it makes it clear as to what we're after. So good governance is epitomized by predictable, open, and enlightened policy making. Bureaucracy is not usually a positive term, but a good one is imbued with professional ethos, acting in furtherance of the public good, the rule of law, transparent processes, and a strong civil society participating in public affairs. Now, again, much broader term than corporate governance there, but I think it's really good how it ties into what those corporate governance pieces are of directed, controlled, and accountable, and within the definitions of policy making. So then we can go poor governance, on the other hand, is characterized by arbitrary policy making, unaccountable bureaucracies, and that's more the bureaucracies that we really don't like, unenforced or unjust legal systems, the abuse of executive power, so they still have that authority piece, they're just dealing with it poorly, and a society unengaged in public life and widespread corruption. So if we tie that back to what corporate governance would be, instead of saying civil there, we'd be talking about civil society, we'd just be talking about our board. How engaged is our board in the affairs of the organization, as opposed to what it says there for the wider definition. But I think that even itself there shows quite clearly why good governance is vital to achieving our goals, because without it, we're not directed at all, and we have no control. And so with that, I could be done, because that's all we really wanted to say here today, right? Why good governance is vital to achieving your goals, but we want to be practical. So just to summarize what we get out of those definitions, it's like first decision making, like good decision making is what we're after. All right, it helps the board make sound decisions, good governance. Out of that, we get the good communication. Well, with that, we need good communication, which is that process of interaction. We have the accountability. We have our checks and balances. That's the control and measure that we talked about in the definitions. And then, although not explicitly stated in the definitions, except the transparency it mentioned can aid in this, we then end up reducing risk. And then a byproduct is also our public image. So poor governance will lead to a bad public image if we think about what the banks have been through recently. But then a good governance leads to a good public image. And then further down from these 6 items will be our mission will be able to be achieved effectively. All right, so let's get practical with what those processes of interaction and decision making are, and this hinges around the board. So where does the board sit? So this diagram illustrates the players within our organizations. Right? We have the government. The government is always there. It can fund us with grants and whatever else. It's the regulator, and we need to be aware of those things. With the ACNC doing its review, there may be things that come in there which can affect all the players that we have listed there, from the members, directors, and management. And so we need to be aware of that. But there's not that good interaction necessarily back to the government. They do request feedback, but most of the time it's the aspect we need to be aware of what's applied to our organizations. So we can see here clearly that the board is sitting in the middle. The board there is governing the company on behalf of the owners, the members. So those can be the members of our associations, if that's how they're structured. It can be our donors or other people who have interest in the organization. And then through our governing measures, the board then interacts with the CEO and management, who then operate, right? And so we make sure we have this clear distinction between the governance piece of the board and the operation piece of the management. But we're just clear, the board represents the members and directs the management. So it's a vital middle piece in the process. So how involved should the board be? The Harvard Business Review in 2005 contained an article which talked about 5 possible board models, which fall along a continuum of least involved to most involved. And we start on the left with the least involved, which is the passive board. Now, the passive board, it functions at the discretion of the CEO. It limits its activities and participation. It limits its accountability. And it ratifies management's preferences. So it rubber stamps. They're there very passively, as it says. As we move along into more involved, we have the certifying board. And this board can certify to shareholders or members, owners, that the CEO is doing what the board expects, and then the management will take corrective action when needed. It emphasizes the need for independent directors and meets without the CEO even. They can stay informed about current performance and designate external board members to evaluate the CEO. And it also helps establish an orderly succession process, which you can still see it's fairly uninvolved. So then we have in the middle, which is I think where most nonprofits sit, and nonprofits in general, and Australia and New Zealand are some of the best governed organisations in the world. And the engaged board really shows where most of these sit. By the virtue of our legal structures, which help put us in this place, which is really good. So the engaged board provides insight, advice, and support to the CEO and management, which is great. Like that's what most of us want from our board. The CEO to be well supported with insight and advice from the board and the breadth of experience the board can have. So they recognise its ultimate responsibility to oversee the CEO and company performance, and they also guide and judge the CEO. So that's really the held account aspect there too. It conducts useful two-way discussions about key decisions facing the company. So we're not at our passive or certifying rubber stamping boards here. We're really involved in steering the ship. It seeks out sufficient industry and financial expertise to add value for decisions. This is where our diversity of experience on the board is very important from all different backgrounds. So interestingly, at the moment, I can't remember the exact numbers, but on a board, it's typically contained with law and financial backgrounds, which are extremely important, and it's easy to see why that's the case. But more and more, we're asking more from our boards, which means that we need to get other expertise on our board, and so that comes with technical, marketing, some customer-facing aspects. So trying to get that breadth is really important. So the Engage board also seeks out, takes the time to define the roles and behaviours required by the board and the boundaries of the CEO and board responsibilities. And this will be well defined in a board charter. I'm not going over a board charter today, but that's probably something to look up if you don't have a board charter in place on really where the line is drawn on different issues between the board and the management. So as we progress on, we've got the intervening board is far more involved, but this model is common in a crisis. They become intensely involved in decision-making around key issues and convene frequent, intense meetings, often on short notice. So often in a crisis, not where you necessarily want to be. But interestingly, as we get to the most involved board, it's the operating board, deepest involved. They make key decisions that management then implements, but they also can then fill the gap in management experience. And so it's like, well, when would this be wanted? This model is common in early stage startups or then early stage non-profits getting up, where you may have your executives in place, but they don't have that have specialized expertise, but don't have that broad management experience. And this can be great for newer organizations getting off the ground, where you've got someone with the passion and the mission, but really need that extra process and management experience around them. And getting a board in place that can really provide that experience is a great way to get started. So highlighting these isn't to put boards into boxes, but just have a consideration of what model best fits your organizations. And like I said, I would say that for most nonprofits, the Engage board is most likely where you'll want to be, and depending on different issues, to the left or right of that a little. So as we look at the board versus the management, now I say versus just to put a stronger word in there, because they're working together, but we need to also know that they're working against each other in a productive way. All right, and so with that clear separation of responsibilities, but also that push and tug, push and pull mentality that goes between a good engaged board compared to a passive board, where there'd be less versing and more dictating. And so we don't want dictating either way. We want that coming together equally. So really the simple way that board and management is usually divided is straight. The board is the strategic and the management is concerned with the operations. And so as we can break down those pieces quite clearly. So the board drives the strategic direction, and this is in discussion and development of what the direction is within the strategic plan and what those measures should be. And then the operations execute that strategic plan. So they'll implement explicit action plans that will lead to the outcomes defined in the strategic plan. The board has to manage risk from the strategic level, which is helping to determine what risks may oppose the organization, or the strategic direction and compliance requirements. So what risks are going to prevent us achieving our strategic goals. And operations deals with operational risk management, so ensures compliance within the organization. The board is responsible for developing the policies that will state the position of the organization. And then we have the nice complementary operations will implement procedures that comply with those policies and directions set. And so all of this is done through the board working through the CEO or general manager. And coming back to our definition, to direct control and held account all happens through the CEO into the organization. So that's to make sure that our board stays engaged but not involved in getting tied up with operations. We work through the CEO. And so then the CEO works with the organization to drive those implementations throughout the organization. So our processes of interaction falls on the board meeting. And this is why the agenda is vitally important, because it defines what will be discussed within the board meetings. So here I'm going to propose a really simple agenda structure that seems to be gaining momentum from all I've seen, and it's a bit flipped from the traditional, because traditionally we have upfront our opens and then our reports and then our motions on notice and then our close or whatnot, a structure like that. But here we're actually going to start with an in-camera session. Now, if you're not familiar with in-camera, the word actually takes its Latin roots for the word chamber, and so it's defined as in private. So in particular, taking place in the private chambers of a judge, with the press and the public excluded is where it comes from. So an in-camera session just allows the board to discuss things that aren't to be shared with others or recorded. So if an in-camera session is required, often it can be around issues with the CEO or salary things or issues with particular directors or whatnot. And if you have to call one explicitly, that can send off flags that, hey, something may be up. So if we put in our regular agenda that we start, and it's essentially before the meeting, with an in-camera session, it provides a less threatening area for management and other stakeholders because it's always there. And it also then provides an excellent opportunity for directors to speak privately and candidly with each other. Such meetings are a good opportunity then during the in-camera sessions to discuss issues with the board's own performance or personal issues a director may be experiencing. They wish to remain private, but that could impact their duties on the board. And this process can also help build great relationships across the boards. But we also need to make sure that during this time, we do not discuss decision-making items, right? And then that discussions are dealt with elsewhere in the agenda. And so there are no minutes recorded for this part of the meeting. So secondly, then, we actually get on to the meeting open. All right, this is where the chair declares the meeting open. We mark the time down on the minutes, and the chair should confirm that a quorum is present. If you don't have a quorum, which is your number of people required to form your meeting, then your constitution should define the process that you follow if it's not met. But here we have a lot of housekeeping things, right? So we mark down our attendance and apologies. We have our conflict of interest up front, so we talk about that each time. Usually it's not a talk about, but it's just that opportunity again to go, has anyone's interests changed? And we can record them here. And disclosure of interest or conflicts of interest is always an interesting one. More often than not, it's typically make sure that you disclose, err on the side of disclosing, right? So something may not be an issue, it may not be a conflict of interest at all, but you're better off disclosing it and having it in those minutes there. But remember, everyone comes from many different places and has many different interests and whatnot. The thing to remember within your board meetings is always wear the hat of the table you're at. So everything you do needs to be in the interest of that organization or what your position is sitting within it. So after our conflicts of interest, we then review our previous minutes. They should have been circulated before the meeting. They can be signed and approved as a true and accurate record of the previous meeting. And this also then gives us time, which should have come out of those previous minutes, any actions arising from the previous board meetings. So this is an important process that shouldn't be skipped over, because this is closing the loop of actual things getting done. We talked about governance being action. Well, here's our action item list. Should be nice and full, and it should be nice and completed each time. So we go through our list of actions that are outstanding and mark off that they're done. Each action should say what is to be done and how it will be done. It should say the person or people that are responsible for carrying it out and the date which it is done by. And so we want to make sure that loop is closed right up at the front of our meeting. And if we have actions that are consistently not getting done, that were due to be done, then we immediately will highlight some issues with our process or whatever else may need discussing, right? It's just that opportunity to expose things. So thirdly, we get on to matters for decision. And this is where it's quite different from the typical, where agendas often had this item down the bottom, which was motions on notice, which is, hey, these are decisions that need to be made right at the bottom of the meeting. But here we inverse the agenda because we want to give more time to the important things. And the decision making, as we saw in the definitions, are the important things that need to be done. It's one of the priority work of the board. So since the board is responsible for making those decisions, we want to make sure that they're done up front, right? And this area can be divided into two groups. You've got your major strategic decisions, or then just other matters for decisions. And for both legal and information purposes, the decisions made by the board are typically the most important content of the meeting's minutes. And so recording these decisions, the outcome of these decisions is also the thing that is usually communicated outside the board. And so the board needs this record to prove due care and diligence. And so each decision has one of two outcomes. It's either approved and some action to be taken, or it's not approved of the taking of some action. And so the minutes should reflect this either of these decisions. If the decision's brought up and it's turned down, that needs to be recorded, not only the approved decisions. But how the things get into the matters for decision is interesting in this process, because nothing in there should be a surprise to the board, because it should have appeared previously in the matters for discussion. So this is where we include our things like our reports from the CEO financial reports, and we'll go into soon about items that we can have on a CEO's report to help aid these discussions and back up our decisions. And this is where these things are raised and input from the board is sought after. So for an example, if the management see an opportunity to open another centre, say, and that's going to be a major decision. Is it in line with the strategic decision? But that is something that the CEO can raise in their report and say, hey, we've got this opportunity we see brewing over here. We'd love to get the board's input on that. And so that item can be brought for a discussion in the first meeting when it first comes up. The board can have input, give great feedback from their breadth and expertise to the CEO, and then that can go back to the management between the meetings and then come up next meeting. Still in a matter of discussion if it's something big like this example, and discussed further based on the information and the input from the directors. And after that process has gone through again, then maybe by the third meeting, it comes up into the matters for decision. So the decision is, are we opening this new centre in XYZ to achieve this part of our strategic plan? And that's all well defined, and it's of no surprise to the board because we've had that discussion and development with the board and with the CEO over this process, discussing these matters, which then raise up into matters of decision. But at the start of the meeting, we get that decision done because that is the important thing that is on the table first. So within those matters for discussion, like one of those items within it may be forthcoming strategic decisions, things that will be bubbling up to those matters of decisions later. Fifth, we have matters for noting. So you'll notice that the importance of our items is intentionally getting lower, right? So matters for noting, they can even just be attached. They don't need to be read or covered at all within the actual meeting. They can just be items that can be read. If something did require discussion or a director felt that that was appropriate, then it needs to be raised with the chair beforehand to be brought up and moved into the matters for discussion. But things that can be for noting would be items such as major correspondence, minutes of subcommittee meetings, an updated calendar, and anything else that may be of interest to directors, such as some industry reports or something like that. And finally, we have our meeting finalization. So here, we just need to wind up with a review of the actions that need to be taken, ensuring that any decisions made are properly assigned actions, due dates, and responsible people. In this process, we can also work together to make sure that the minutes will reflect the decisions and the discussions that were taken. Now, this is an interesting one because I often ask people who is responsible for the minutes. And the answers come back varied. Often it's the secretary, maybe it's the chair because they sign them off. But what I really promote is that everyone is responsible for the minutes. Right? The minutes are a reflection of what has happened within that meeting. And a good way to put it, which I've heard a few times, is consider writing your minutes as if they're a letter to a future unknown judge. And so that's where we don't want them to have to be. But if that's what happens, then do those minutes well reflect what went on to make sure that you have done your due diligence and process and duty of care over it, and your minutes are your records to show that. And so if we spend that little bit of extra time at the end of the meeting to make sure that we have this all summarized well, then there's no back and forth about who said what, and we can all agree, and that process is made a bit smoother. So along with the reviewing of our items, we can now work together to confirm any public disclosures required. So our board can be toing and froing internally a lot within the meeting, and that can be good and constructive. But outside of the meeting, we need to be unified as a board, not as an individual director. So the board's position is this, the board's position is that. And here we get the opportunity to say, okay, out of these decisions that were made, what ones need to be publicly disclosed? What is the process of disclosing them? And who will do so? And then what other information that was discussed needs to ensure that it does remain confidential, which is most like it's on confidential and explicitly state what needs to be externally put out. And then next, within the close, we can perform a meeting evaluation, which we'll go over later today. And then finally, set or confirm when the next meeting is, and close the meeting, noting the time in the minutes. But here I'll stop. Eric, do we have any questions? Is much of that clear? Do we need some more detail on any of those pieces?
We have actually got a question here. So we've got Scott Walters, who's asked, from a physical point of view, do the minutes reflect that the meeting went into, out of, in camera? Does the paid secretary leave the room, or is there a hidden component of the minutes that are from the in-camera session? And if so, who records them?
Wow, that is a very good question. I would want to look that up myself as well explicitly. My understanding is that the in-camera session, I've seen both, right? And that's why I'd want to look it up. But sometimes the in-camera session is just noted that there was an in-camera session. When that happens, certainly all recording devices are turned off. The minutes secretary, especially ones who have external ones, do leave the room. But whether it's marked in the minutes of there was an in-camera here or not, I can't give you a definitive answer. And so I know it will appear on an agenda typically. If you're doing this process, it'll always be there on the agenda. Reflected in the minutes, I think that comes down to a matter of preference. Does that help?
Hopefully that does, Matthew. Thanks for that. That's the only question that we've got for now, so please continue.
Okay, will do. All right, so the CEO's report. Now, here we get the opportunity to really, this comes in on our matters for discussion. So here the CEO has the opportunity to leverage that expertise and breadth of experience of the board. All right, so the first item on the report can be current significant issues, right? We want an overview of any significant current issues facing the organization. So these may be continued on from previous meetings, or it could be a new issue, right? And when we're presenting these, remember, we're not after, hey, we're having this problem, this is what it is, and then move on. It's really trying to present it not as just information, but to allow the CEO to obtain input and feedback from the directors, right? It's using that experience and expertise of the board. Next, matters for approval. Now, here within the CEO's report, anything the CEO needs approved by the board, which are not covered elsewhere in the agenda, can be put here. And again, it's at the top because making those decisions is important and needs to be covered early. But if we're using the agenda structure we just mentioned before, we've got that specific area which is matters for decision. So most of the things are up in there. But there are some things that can be for the CEO specific issues that make more sense to be put in here, such as personal leave or expenses or something like that to be included at this point of the agenda. Thirdly, we get on to the update of the strategic plan implementation. Remember, we want to keep everything strategic on the board, but we want those controls and measures, right? And so the way that the board gets that information is by what the CEO will report to them. So here they can give an update on the strategic plan and major reviews on progress on the corporate plan should be covered every 3 or so months, right? So this is where we've got the high-level strategic plan. We don't want, and we see it so much, the strategic plan, it's like we put this document together, this is great, everyone's right behind our vision, this is what we're gonna do, and then what happens to that document? Gets put in a drawer and never seen again until 3 years later when it's time to put together a new strategic plan. And then it's like, oh yeah, when we get back to it 3 years later, we're like, yeah, that was some real good ideas. How do we do on that? And it's like, well, not usually too well if we're not keeping tabs on our progress, which is our iterative approach we need to have on any of this. So the CEO should have an action-oriented business plan, which is structured to progress the goals of the strategic plan. And within the report here, they can report on the progress through those actions and where we are up to each item on those. So it may be desirable to talk in greater detail on performance of particular units and maybe not cover everything, but 1 or 2 business units at a time. And over the year, we get across all the business functions of the organization if we've got quite a lot going on. And this doesn't fall just on the CEO to produce. So if we are in a larger organization, the manager responsible for this part of the strategic plans, operation and execution, certainly can be the one writing the report and provide it to the CEO to report to the board. The CEO needs to be across it, but they don't need to necessarily be doing it all themselves, right? Especially if you've got the staff to be able to help. Which then also leads on to what our key performance indicators are. And we hear KPIs a lot, and are KPIs good or not? It's like, well, we measure what we want to change. So picking good KPIs is really difficult, but this is also a job that the board should have done, developing the strategic plan. And maybe strategic planning is another webinar we can go into at another time, because there is a lot that can be involved in that, to making sure it is right and that these other processes then work well to making sure we get towards our goals. And so when we're reporting on our KPIs, we can have our financial or non-financial. We might just be going, well, where are we on our budget? And then where are we on our lead indicators to what items are in our strategic plan, whether it's number of services provided, maybe it's our staffing numbers, maybe it's our number of clients that we've been bringing on, or whatever it is. And measuring impact is a whole nother aspect for nonprofits that is really difficult, because with typical organizations, when we're talking about measuring performance, we talk about financial. It all comes down to profit. And that's not the purpose of a nonprofit. And so finding those KPIs that are measuring the impact of our strategic goals is hard to do, but vital to do, because again, we need to measure what we want to change. And just having that even in a traffic light table can be clear, so that the board can clearly see, yes, we've got 5 greens, here's an amber, here's a red. When we've got something that's not green, especially, we should usually have a comment there from the CEO explaining why, and potentially draw out a bit of discussion around those items and what the board may be able to do to help either adjust the strategic plan because something isn't working all right, or provide advice or input into how to get those items back on track. Fifth, we have our risk and compliance update. And depending on what actions management have taken between board meetings, this section may have 2 components. Firstly would be the update on risk and compliance management. So on any significant outcomes from ongoing work on risk and compliance. And then also reporting on risk and compliance incidents. So a brief outline of those is worthwhile for the board to make sure the board is across any incidents that may be occurring. So whether it's a workplace health and safety incident, a query from the government. I hope you're not under review from the ACNC from a consumer complaint or something like that. It may or may not be a big thing, but they should all be mentioned so that the board is aware of anything that could be threatening is a risk, the organisation. And then the CEO's report can have a section for matters for noting. And these can include such things like significant meetings the CEO's gone into, whether they've seen significant donors or government involvement or whatnot, or maybe other organizations that have visited yours and things like that. Alrighty, decision-making framework. Eric, I'll just quick pause again if there's any other questions that have raised from that.
We have got a question here from Wen Bezina, who asked if you could show a sample of the strategic plan layout and the KPI traffic lights report.
Oh, yeah, that would be cool. No, I can't show you one right now, but like I said, I think I think the question's been put on the survey after the meeting of what other topics you would like to go over, and I think strategic planning might be a good one because they can vary a lot. And so I would suggest at the moment just go online and search for sample strategic plans. There's some really good books around it as well. Like there's and again it's quite philosophical, a lot of these discussions. So there's proponents, big proponents of the one-page strategic plans, OPSP. I'm trying to think of the name, Vern something. Anyway, the book, I can follow up with that later if Wayne wants to throw his email address over, of some books I've read that that really cover in depth well of good strategic planning methods and how one can be laid out. Because the proponents of the one-page strategic plan, it's really good. You've got your commander's intent up the top of what your goals are. You've got your KPIs clearly defined, and each board meeting that can be updated, and you've just got that really clear management of it. But yeah, there are lots of ways to do it, but that's a great question.
Fantastic. That's right. We've had a couple other people chime in since then. So we had Kelvin McCarroll, who followed up on that also thinks that would be great and thinks templates would be a good idea. And then Sarah Allen has clarified, I think that it's Vern Harnish, if that rings a bell.
I think so, yeah.
Yep. Otherwise,
Excellent.
That's it for now.
Cool. All right, decision making. So here is it's again, you can search for templates. Templates are everywhere on the internet, and it's about finding ones that suit for you. So the decision-making framework here that I'm promoting is just a few starting questions that I think are useful. And whether you put this together in a policy or just as a document that directors review frequently, just to get thinking of different aspects of decisions that, may be coming up. So before decision making, we've got items that we need to think over. So these are questions you should be asking yourself or explicitly the board. And I know I had a subcommittee meeting last night, and question number 3 there, do we need to make this decision now, was asked. Like, we had a decision on the table, and it's like, well, does it need to be made now? Because and that's a clear one. So anyway, the point of these questions is while items especially are in the matters for discussion, what should we be asking ourselves and the board about them to make sure that we're pulling out all the information we need so that we can make a good decision? So is the matter for decision clear and well formulated? So at the point of the discussion, it's like, well, what decision point are we leading up to? Like, yeah, we just need to be clear and well formulated. So by the time that we get to is it a decision, everyone is well understood of what the impacts of that decision will be. Are the options well specified? I know that this is another one I've seen come up a lot, where it's like management is asking for a large budget for an items, and then says these are the outputs, and it's like, okay, well, that sounds like it might be okay, budget outputs, but it's like, well, what are the options in there? It's like, well, if we can only budget half of that, what would our outputs be? And so just trying to pull away from what's presented and give some other options that come around it. As I've mentioned already, do we need to make this decision now? And so this is a good one, because it can stop a discussion that isn't going to get anywhere and isn't important at the time. So it's like, well, does this decision need to be made now? And if the answers are no, then that allows more time for discussion outside of the board meeting, management to prepare more information or whatnot around that item. But another thing to be aware of when asking a question like that is also look at the opportunity cost. All right, so if we don't make this decision now, like, we don't have to, maybe, but if we don't make it now, what is the consequence around that? And do we need to obtain more information? So that's quite straightforward. During decision making, so when the decision's on the table, is this decision aligned with our strategic goals? This is where having the good strategic plan and position in place is just really important, because I suffer from shiny object syndrome, and when we see a good opportunity, it's like, oh yeah, we've got to go take that. But if you're popping your head up like a meerkat and looking around at every opportunity, then you're not going to get towards what your strategic goals are, because you'll be too split. And so making sure that those strategic goals are the right thing, and then all our decisions are aligning to achieving those strategic goals, then that is the framework that all decisions need to be made on. Are they strong advocates? That should be there. Are there strong advocates, and have minorities been heard? So this is where it's make sure that that you've got a few things going on right within your board here. Is this decision coming forward simply because you have a very loud advocate, and that loud advocate could be right, they could be a loud minority, or it could be the majority really advocates it, but then do you have some minority views that just haven't been heard properly yet, and have they not had the opportunity, which they just may not be speaking up, but when they do, they can sometimes really swing the whole board. So has everybody really been well heard on it, or are we hearing echo chambers as well? Are we continuing to back a failed decision? This question is very hard, because there's the sunk cost fallacy. And when we go, oh, we've already spent this much money, this much time, this much effort on achieving something, that shouldn't necessarily be taken into account when making this decision. So the decision to be made now is this the right thing to do right now with the information we have, right? Not based on what was done on the past, but based on the current state of things. And choosing to drop then things that had been done before and maybe got no result, but continuing them would not be a good idea, would not be the right decision. That's a really hard thing to pull sometimes. And has the impact on all stakeholders been considered? Yes, remember the board sitting in the middle there. So after decision making, has the best approach for communicating the decision been decided? So how is it going out? Is it via a newsletter? Is it the CEO to management? Do we make a press release? Do all parties understand the communication protocol? So if we're making a press release, then directors aren't to mention anything until after that press release or something like that. And then has someone been assigned responsibility for implementation? So these are just some questions to really get you thinking around outside decisions that are on. And again, with our build, measure, learn, pick some questions that make sense for you. Search for some other templates that give a whole bunch of different questions to ask. And yeah, just start with something that can try and broaden the discussion and thought around each decision. So that's really the purpose of having a decision-making framework in place. All right, so when we're measuring after we've done something, we need to ask ourselves, again, good questions and good self-evaluation to make sure we're going to improve the process. So in our self-evaluation, we've got two levels of them for the board, I think, that are quite vital. Firstly is the meeting evaluation, and we mentioned this before in the agenda, that the meeting evaluation can be done at the end of each meeting. And it's interesting how this is done, because typically it's done with one member is assigned it and maybe known, maybe not known, so we don't know who's evaluating us in this particular meeting. And then they go through these questions and talk it out to the board. I haven't seen it done, but I'd love to see it done more, of this being done confidentially by all members and then aggregated results at the end. But I don't think that needs to be done on a well-functioning board, because a well-functioning board shouldn't have an issue with a director saying, hey, this was done poorly, or this needed to be brought in line, because we really need that open, transparent discussion. And if we can't get that on the board, then perhaps we have an issue. So some simple questions to ask. And again, you can search for multiple templates on what these are. Find something that makes sense for you and just get started and see if it helps improve your processes. So these are some of the questions that I like out of the templates. But it's meeting preparation, agenda and relevant papers distributed, and previous minutes clear and distributed within well time. Just rate it 1 to 5. Were the members prepared and have they read the papers? And we can, I've seen on boards I've been on as well, it's like, we can see who didn't read the papers. because they're asking questions that were clearly answered in the papers, and they're not going beyond what was just stated in the papers with their questions. So it's like, call that out, because everyone's time's important, and we want to get the value from them and others, not reiterate over things that were available beforehand. Was the agenda adhered to and the chair directed discussion? So this is a good chair reining things in and just keeping that on track instead of jumping all over that agenda. Because if we're following the agenda structure above, we want to make sure those important things are done first. And if we're jumping down into unrelated discussions and not being able to get those decisions done, then that can be an issue. And the chair can also help direct that meeting finalization to get those summaries or whatnot. And so there's some other things that can be thought about when assessing how meetings went. Time allocation, that runs with the agenda adhered to, but most important topics receive the most attention. I've heard countless examples of almost the whole meeting being taken up by what color a team t-shirt should be over when there's clear, big strategic issues that should be on the table and discussed, but red versus blue gets the most attention. So those things need to be reined in, and we really need to focus on what's important. And actually, a lot of the time with that is when you do find you're getting into discussions like that, it's that we're getting into discussions that are operational and not actually of the purview of the board. So openness of communication, respect for minority views, and willingness of members to participate in discussions, which we kind of covered in our decision framework as well. So is everyone actually being heard? And this comes down to the chair again too. If you see someone sitting quietly there, they might be quietly contemplating, they might be quietly disagreeing. And so the chair can be responsible also for helping tease out views across the board. And were decisions made as required? The most important, one of the most important functions of the board, right? And then did they effectively operate as a group? So we can do that at the end of every meeting to try and improve our meeting process, but that last question leads us on to a process that can be done potentially annually, which is the whole board evaluation. And a good time to do this is just before a board retreat, where we're going to be getting deeper into things, but also then we can evaluate how our actual board is doing and what the board needs to do. And so here's some questions that can help with that. It's, do the members understand the organization's mission? And, you know, at first when you get a director on, they may not be as clear as more experienced one on what the exact mission is. And this can be a good reflection, because then it's like, well, do we need to improve the clarity of what our organization's mission as well? Does the board have clear goals and actions resulting from relevant and realistic strategic planning? So it comes into that strategic planning again. Do they regularly monitor and evaluate progress? So this ties into that CEO report aspect. Are the board clear on what those items are? The board attends to policy-related decisions which effectively guide operational activities for staff, right? So the board, again, in directing, needs to have that direction clear that these operations can go with. The board helps set fundraising goals and is actively involved in fundraising. This is quite an important one for nonprofits. Do we need to mix up the members of our board so that we can access different avenues of fundraising? Are the boards actively introducing new donors through their networks that they can bring into the organization? And does the board effectively represent the organization to the community? Just quickly to summarize, like John C. Maxwell says, anyone can steer a ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. And so you can have great execution from management, but if your governance and your board is not operating effectively and setting good direction, it will certainly not be as effective as it could be. So I hope from the talk, you've now got a very clear picture of what governance is with those definitions, how the board interacts with management, a good process of interaction through board meetings, agendas, and reports. And I hope you can start putting together a clear decision-making framework for yourself, which you can iterate and improve on with what makes sense for you and your board, and to iterate and improve with the build, measure, learn process so that we can evaluate our meeting performance and our board performance frequently. Thanks so much for taking the time with me today. I hope this information has been in value to you and you can take something from it and improve your governance process. And keeping with the ship quotes, Brian Tracy says, if you want to sail your ship in a different direction, you must turn 1 degree at a time. All right, so thanks everybody. And if there's any more questions, I'm happy to try and answer those.
Fantastic, Matthew. We have got a couple of questions here, which I'll try and go through a little bit quickly. So the first question we've got is from Anne Stewart Ball, who's asked, is good decision making having a board where each member is part of a team and with a chairperson who identifies if the minorities are being swamped out by those strong voices?
So can you repeat that? Sorry, I'm just...
Yep, no, that's right, I will. So she's asked, and I know that I think you did cover this a little bit, but basically the question is good decision making having a board where each member is part of a team and with a chairperson who identifies if those minority voices or minorities are being swamped out by the stronger voices in the group?
Yeah, so I did cover that a bit, didn't I? Yeah, like, you know, a minority view may be the right decision, and that's a really difficult thing for the board to bring forward. But making sure that everyone's being heard, and then it comes back to wearing the hat of where you were at, right? Is the decision the right one for the board, not for the majority, or the right one for the organization, right? So does that answer it, perhaps?
That I think that should do for now. Thanks, Matthew. I think the last question we've got here is from Julie Melia, and it's a bit of an interesting one. So I think I'll try and repeat it as is. So let me know if we need to go through it again. But the question she's asked is, thinking of the members in the context of this question as being the owners for the organization, on an enrollment form, they ask members to tick yes or no to membership to ensure wide member ownership of organization. Should the signature be the default membership unless the person specifies they wish to opt out? Basically, it looks like they want their membership base to reflect the actual people who regularly use and participate in an organization, which perhaps I'm just interpreting it might be a little bit sideways here, but I mean, is there any insight you'd be able to shed on that?
So is this about who our organization will be representing as such? And so who is the board representing within that membership? Is that what you're understanding with there?
Julie's just said yes to that.
Okay, yeah, well, so like this is a really interesting question because does the board, like your organization will have a mission and a purpose for why it existed in the first place, and then members will gather around what that is. If the board is changing that direction, is the board doing it because strategically that's where it needs to go so the organization will continue, or do you have new members coming on which are changing the path of that organization? Like, no organization is to stay stale in where it is in the same place because everything else externally keeps changing. So whether you're trying to encourage a membership base to be supportive of your current position or have a wider membership base that may steer the direction of the organization to a different place, that's a really interesting discussion that could be had.
All right, fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Matthew. I think it looks like that's it for now. So we have got some feedback that was a fabulous presentation, and it's starting to come in now. So thanks very much for presenting today, and thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope you all did learn a lot from this webinar and that we managed to get through your questions. If you did have any questions pending that we didn't get to or that come back to later, just please send that through to events@connectingup.org, and please feel free to send your feedback there as well, and we'll get to that offline. You can also contact Matthew. He has had his contact details throughout the session at the bottom of the slides, and they will be available as well in the recording, so feel free to reach out to him too. With that being said, don't forget that we will be making the recording available for you all next week, so do keep an eye out on your inbox because we will be sending a link out for that for you. Again, thanks all for being with us. Thank you, Matthew, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks very much.